Peak Practice turned the Beeches surgery into a place you felt you had lived, then let its doctors leave one by one. 3 faces from that Derbyshire hillside are gone now. 1 to cancer, 1 at 100 years old, 1 cause never made public, a fortune was turned down. Kevin Whately has spent a career leaving rooms while the applause was still loud. He walked out of Peak Practice in 1995. At the exact moment, the show was drawing more than 14 million viewers a week, and years later, he stepped back from the detective franchise that had made him a household name across 2 decades. In the 2025 New Year honours, he was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, recognised for services to drama and to charity, a quiet reward for a man who rarely chased the spotlight. On the show, he played Dr Jack Kerruish, the partner returning from Africa, decent and restless and forever half looking at the door. Whately was born near Cardale in February 1951, the son of a Royal Navy commander and a teacher, and a distant descendant of Richard Whately, the 19th century Archbishop of Dublin. He grew up on the North Tyneside coast, one of those northeastern childhoods that leave a warmth in the voice for life, and came to acting sideways rather than through an early ambition, working his way up through the folk and theatre circuit before television found him. He earned his first real fame far from any hospital set as the plasterer Neville Hope in Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, the sweet-natured member of a gang of British builders working abroad, a role that made audiences laugh at him and then worry for him. He deepened that trust as Sergeant Robbie Lewis beside John Thaw across years of Inspector Morse, so that by the time Peak Practice cast him, viewers already felt they had known him for years, and his Dr Kerruish arrived carrying all of that goodwill with him. His exit in 1995 came wrapped in tabloid noise, with rumours of an affair between Whately and his co-star Amanda Burton that both actors flatly denied. The story said far more about the appetite of the newspapers of the day than about either person caught inside it, and both walked away from the show with their marriages intact and their private lives their own. What the reporting missed was the size of the gamble. Peak Practice had handed Whately his first real leading man role after years of playing the trusted sidekick, first to John Thaw across the Inspector Morse years and earlier as one of the lads in Auf Wiedersehen Pet, and he chose to give that leading role back while the programme was still among the most watched dramas in the country. Very few actors walk away from a hit at its height even once, and he would go on to do it a second time. That marriage is the real headline of his life. Whately wed the actress Madeleine Newton in 1984, a woman born in the same Northumberland town just 3 weeks apart from him, and more than 40 years later they remain together, settled in Buckinghamshire. They raised 2 children, Kitty, born in 1983, who became a classical mezzo-soprano performing with the Royal Opera, and Kieran, born in 1985. Much of Whately's charity work has gone to dementia causes, a fight that reached his own family when both his mother and his mother-in-law lived with the illness, and he has raised money and awareness for years while saying very little about it in public. He is the sort of man who lets the work and the giving speak and keeps the interviews to a minimum. Dr Jack Kerruish could never quite stop leaving. Kevin Whately built a whole career out of the same instinct, walking away from hit after hit at the peak, while the one thing he never left was the girl from his hometown. Amanda Burton once turned down a reported £250,000 a year, and every role she took afterwards proved she had read the moment correctly. She was offered around £250,000 to stay on Peak Practice in 1995, a staggering figure for British television of that era, and she said no, leaving the surgery at the same time as Kevin Whately and walking straight into the part that would define her. Within the show, she was Dr. Beth Glover, the calm emotional centre of the Beeches, the doctor who actually listened. Burton was born in Derry, In October 1956, the youngest of four sisters, the daughter of a primary school headmaster raised in Northern Ireland during years that were far from easy. She came up through theatre before television found her, learning the trade on the stage rather than in front of a camera, and her first great success was Heather Havisham in Brookside, a leading role in Channel 4's Liverpool soap that she played from 1982 to 1986. Heather made her a national name almost overnight, one of the most popular characters in an enormously popular show, and yet Burton chose to leave when she felt she had lost sympathy with the woman she was playing, walking away on her own terms rather than clinging to the security. Departing strong parts at the right moment became something of a pattern for her, a discipline most actors never manage even once. The rumours that trailed her peak practice exit, the same whispered story that followed Whately, were denied by everyone involved and faded quickly. What did not fade was the choice she had made. In 1996, Burton became Dr. Sam Ryan in Silent Witness, the forensic pathologist who anchored one of the most successful British dramas of the following decade, a role she held until 2004 and returned to briefly in 2022. The fortune she had refused was dwarfed by what came next. Her private life was quieter and, for a stretch, harder. Burton married the photographer Sven Arnstein in 1989, and together they had two daughters, Phoebe, born in 1989, and Brid, born in 1990, before the marriage ended in divorce in 2004. In 2011, she suffered a stroke, recovered from it, and simply kept working, choosing rarely to raise it in public and never once trading on it for sympathy. Losing both of the show's biggest leads inside a single year, first Whately and then Burton should by rights have finished peak practice, and yet the programme carried on for another 7 years, a measure of how much affection the setting itself had earned. At 69, living in London, she remains one of the most recognisable dramatic actresses of her generation. Amanda Burton walked away from the biggest check of her peak practice years, and the calm certainty with which Dr. Beth Glover made her decisions turned out to be the truest thing about the woman playing her. Haydn Gwynne was diagnosed with cancer in September 2023, and roughly a month later, she was gone, a speed that stunned everyone who had worked with her. She died in a hospital in the small hours of Friday, the 20th of October 2023, aged 66, surrounded by her two sons, her family, and her closest friends, only weeks after learning she was ill. Very few people even knew she was unwell, which is why the news reached the theatre world like a blowout of nowhere. 1 month, she was a working actress at the height of her powers, and the next, she was gone. The suddenness of it made the loss land twice as hard across British stage and screen among people who had assumed they had years of her performances still ahead of them. For a single series, she was Dr. Joanna Graham on peak practice, a crisp, watchful intelligence who made every scene around her feel sharper and more dangerous. She was born in Sussex in March 1957 and took a route into acting that almost nobody else on that call sheet shared. Gwynne studied modern languages at the University of Warwick and then spent 5 years lecturing in Italy before she ever turned to the stage, arriving in the profession later than most and with a mind trained on literature and language. That patience showed in everything she did afterwards. She seemed to understand a script the way a scholar understands a difficult text. Television knew her long before peak practice through the newsroom satire Drop the Dead Donkey, which brought her a BAFTA nomination, and audiences of the following decades came to know her through The Windsors, where she played Camilla across 7 years of broad comedy, and through The Crown, Her real home, though, was the theatre, where she was quietly one of the most admired stage actresses in the country. Gwynne earned a Drama Desk Award on Broadway in 2009 for Billy Elliot the Musical, playing the tough ballet mistress, and she was nominated for the Olivier Award 5 separate times across her career. She played Margaret Thatcher on stage in the audience opposite Helen Mirren's Queen, and she moved between comedy and tragedy with a control that made directors trust her with anything. Colleagues spoke of a sharp wit and a fierce intelligence, the kind of performer who lifted everyone in the scene with her. Her family life she kept largely out of the papers, and that privacy deserves respect. Gwynne shared her London life with the psychotherapist Jason Phipps, from whom she had more recently separated while the two remained friends, and together they had raised 2 sons, Orlando, born in 1997, and Kane, born in 2000. Those 2 young men were at her bedside when she died, and months later they would stand on a stage in her place. The final chapter of her story arrived in April 2024, 6 months after her death. Gwynne won the Laurence Olivier Award for Best Actress in a Supporting Role for her performance in When Winston Went to War with the Wireless, the highest honour British theatre can give, and the recognition she had chased across 5 previous nominations, handed to her at last when she was no longer there to hold it. Her sons walked up to accept the award on her behalf, and the room fell quiet as they spoke of a fierce, brilliant artist and a much-loved mother. Everyone in that theatre understood exactly what British stage and screen had lost in the space of a single month, and the applause that followed was as much grief as celebration. Dr. Joanna Graham noticed everything and missed nothing. Haydn Gwynne was the kind of actress a country cannot easily replace, and she was taken in barely 30 days, the highest honour of her working life, arriving only after she could no longer feel its weight. Simon Shepherd married a woman who would go on to win an Academy Award, and their marriage has now lasted more than 45 years. He wed the costume designer Alexandra Byrne in 1980, long before either of them was established, and stayed married to her through the decades, in which she became one of the most decorated designers in film, winning the Oscar for Elizabeth the Golden Age in 2007, and later dressing the heroes of the Marvel films. On peak practice, he was Dr. Will Preston, buttoned and principled, the man who followed the rules even when the rules cost him. Shepherd was born in Bristol in August 1956 and trained at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School after coming up through the National Youth Theatre. He was the show's spine in a way, one of the very few doctors who kept being brought back. He served across the early years from 1993 to 1997 and then returned for the final stretch from 2000 to 2002. Making him the longest serving of all the surgery's medics. Where other leads chased the exit door, the production kept reaching for the safe pair of hands, and his loyalty to the show was answered by the show's loyalty to him. He anchored peak practice through its most turbulent years of cast turnover, the reliable centre around which one doctor after another arrived and departed, and the show leaned on that reliability again and again. Together, Shepherd and Byrne raised 4 children: Ben, born in 1988, the twins Billy and Arthur, born in 1992, and Beatrice, born in 1996. It is a large, settled family built quietly around 2 careers that could hardly be more different. Hers behind the camera, shaping how history looks on screen, his in front of it. His work did not stop when peak practice ended. Shepherd had already been a familiar face through the drama Chancer and had played Edgar Linton in a 1992 adaptation of Wuthering Heights, and after his surgery days, he moved into Casualty as Dr. Jonathan Barling, keeping the medical dramas that had always suited his careful, upright presence. Between the screen roles, he returned regularly to the stage that had trained him, working steadily and without fuss, the kind of actor who fills a career with good parts rather than headlines. At 69, he still works across stage and screen, never quite a leading celebrity, always a respected professional and a familiar face to anyone who watched British drama across the last 4 decades. Dr. Will Preston stayed when almost everyone else left. Simon Shepherd carried that same steadiness into a life that stayed put too, married for 4.5 decades to the woman he chose at the very start. Gary Mavers grew up between 2 brothers who wrote one of the most enduring British pop songs of the 1990s, and he chose acting instead of the band. He is the younger brother of Lee Mavers, the frontman of the Lays, the group behind There She Goes, and the older brother of the band's drummer Neil Mavers, which makes his the least musical and quietly happiest career in a Liverpool family full of them. He arrived on peak practice as Dr. Andrew Atwood, a rougher, warmer presence who felt native to the hills and drew a large and loyal following. Mavers was born in Liverpool in September 1964 and trained at RADA after cutting his teeth with the Liverpool Thespians, the amateur company that shaped so many Merseyside performers. He joined the surgery in 1995, exactly as Whately and Burton were leaving, walking in to fill the space left by 2 of British television's biggest names, which is no small thing to ask of an actor. He stayed for 5 years until 2000, one of the longer runs on a show that rarely kept anyone that long. And for a while, he was the warm, grounded face that held peak practice together through its middle years, the doctor the audience most wanted to sit across from. His following was large and genuine, built on a masculinity that felt gentler and more real than the leading men who came before him. His home life sits far from the drama of his characters' storylines. Mavers married the makeup artist Sue Mavers, and they raised their daughters in a 16th century house on the outskirts of Liverpool, holding on to the city his family has always belonged to. One of those daughters, Abby Mavers, followed him into the profession and became known as Dynasty Barry in the BBC school drama Waterloo Road, carrying the family name into a new generation of television. After the surgery closed its doors, he kept working steadily, playing Will Manning in Casualty across 2004 and 2005, and later taking on one of the hardest roles of his entire career as Gordon Livesey in Emmerdale in 2015 and 2016. Gordon was revealed to have abused his own son, Aaron, as a child, and the storyline became a landmark piece of British soap drama, praised for the care it took with a subject most programmes avoid entirely. Playing a man capable of that took real courage from an actor whose own life could hardly be further from it, and choosing difficult material over easy fame became his signature. Dr. Andrew Atwood belonged to those Derbyshire hills. Gary Mavers belonged to Liverpool. And while his brothers made the records, he built the steadiest life of them all, at 61, still rooted in the city where he started. One recurring player on that call sheet had already been a screen star for 4 decades before she ever walked into the Beeches. Sylvia Syms spent the last year of her life at Denville Hall, the care home for retired actors in London, and she died there on the 27th of January 2023, just 3 weeks after her 89th birthday. The cause was never made public, and her children asked that she be remembered for her laughter rather than her final illness. Her death closed one of the longest careers in British film, more than 70 years of work reaching all the way back to the 1950s. Her peak practice role was small, a recurring part in the early years, but older viewers recognised her the instant she appeared because they had grown up watching her. Syms was born in South London in January 1934 and became a film star in the middle of that decade when British cinema was at its height. she carried more than 150 screen credits, among them Ice Cold in Alex in 1958, in which she crossed the desert alongside John Mills in one of the most famous British war films ever made, and the brave, controversial drama Victim in 1961, a film that took real risks with the social attitudes of its time. Her finest hour may have been Woman in a Dressing Gown, the 1957 film that brought her a BAFTA nomination and stands as one of the great performances of the British New Wave, a portrait of an ordinary marriage falling apart that still holds its power today. Working across 7 decades, she shared the screen with the biggest names of post-war British film. Taking a modest recurring television part late in her career was simply the reality for great actresses of her generation once the film offers slowed, and she never pretended otherwise, treating the small parts with the same seriousness she gave the leading ones. Her private life she lived openly, including its harder passages. Syms married Alan Edney, her childhood sweetheart, in 1956 at the very start of her rise to film stardom, and the marriage lasted more than 30 years until their divorce in 1989. She never hid the pain of that ending, speaking about it honestly in an age when public figures were expected to keep such things behind closed doors, and that candor was part of why audiences felt they knew her. The couple had 2 children, and one of them, Beattie Edney, born in 1962, became an actress in her own right, seen opposite Christopher Lambert in Highlander and later in the television adaptation of Poldark, carrying her mother's profession into another generation, while her son, Ben Edney, built a life away from the cameras. There was a strange full circle near the end of her career. Syms, who had spent a lifetime as one of the faces of British cinema, played Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in the 2006 film The Queen opposite Helen Mirren, a piece of casting that seemed to gather up her whole standing in the national imagination and set it on screen one last time. That she should be handed a role at the very heart of the royal story, near the close of a career that began when Britain still had cinemas on every high street, felt entirely right. When she died, her children, Beattie and Ben, spoke with striking tenderness, saying that she had given them joy and laughter right up to the end, and that only the day before her death they had sat together reminiscing about all their adventures. Few farewells from a family are so free of bitterness or regret. That tiny country surgery part was played by 70 years of British film history. Most viewers never realised the woman on their screen had once been among the biggest stars in the country, and Sylvia Syms carried all of it without ever asking them to notice. Maggie O'Neill played the last Doctor Peak practice ever left hanging, quite literally, and the story was never finished. In the final scene ever broadcast in January 2002, her character, Dr. Alex Redman, was dragged over the edge of a quarry. The screen cut to black, and the show was cancelled before anyone learned whether she lived. More than 6.5 million people were still watching. Yet ITV and Carlton had decided the programme had grown tired, and so the ending simply never came. She was Dr. Alex Redman, the doctor left dangling in midair as the credits rolled on 12 years of television. O'Neill was born in the Midlands in November 1962, the youngest of 6 children, raised by 2 head teachers and educated at a convent school before she trained at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, one of the country's toughest and most respected acting schools. She made her stage debut in 1985 and appeared early in her career in the acclaimed film Gorillas in the Mist in 1988, the true story of the naturalist Dian Fossey, a serious credit for a young actress finding her feet. She arrived on peak practice near the end of its run in 2000 and stayed until the axe fell in 2002, holding the strange distinction of joining a show for its final act and then being written into the most famous unresolved moment in its entire history. Someone had to be at the center of that cliff edge, and it was her. The cancellation was never aimed at her, but it stranded her character in a way few actors ever experience. A joint decision between the makers and ITV ended the series after 12 years, with the verdict that the programme had become tired, and the cliffhanger that should have opened another series became instead a question mark hanging over the whole show forever. For the actor at the centre of it, there was no resolution to play, no final beat to land. What she did next answered the silence. O'Neill went on to one of the strongest post-peak practice careers of anyone in the cast, playing Sheila Jackson in the Channel 4 drama Shameless, a raw, funny, frightened woman terrified of the world beyond her own front door, and one of that series' most memorable creations. She joined EastEnders in 2008 and returned to comedy in the Scottish hit Two Doors Down across 2019 and 2023, building 2 decades of work that needed no cliffhanger to feel complete. Where her peak practice character was left forever unfinished, the actress herself kept finishing things, role after role, each one a small, complete answer to that scene over the quarry. At 63, she remains busy and in demand, one of those character actors whose face brings instant recognition even when the name takes a moment. Dr. Alex Redman was left with her fate unknown, swinging over a Derbyshire quarry. Maggie O'Neill answered that unfinished ending with a career that resolved itself again and again on her own terms. Here is a question for the comments below. When that last scene cut to black above the quarry, what did you always believe happened to Dr. Alex Redman? Tell me what you decided. Adrian Lukis made a career out of playing men you were meant to distrust, and then he sat down and wrote his most famous villain a second act. He is known far beyond peak practice as George Wickham, the charming scoundrel of the 1995 BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and decades later he co-wrote and starred in a one-man stage play, Being Mr. Wickham, that imagined the character as an old man looking back on his life. For 2 years, he was Dr. David Shearer on Peak Practice, a calm, capable presence steering the surgery through one of its many reinventions. Lukis was born in Birmingham in March 1957 and trained for the stage before becoming a regular television face from the late 1980s onward. He joined Peak Practice in 1997 and stayed until 1999, one more doctor in the long rotation, arriving in the show's middle years when the cast turned over almost from series to series. His steadiness suited a program that badly needed continuity. His private life he has kept firmly to himself, and there is little in the public record beyond his work, which is exactly how he seems to prefer it. What is on the record is a career built on a particular kind of role, the charmer, the schemer, the man in the good suit you should never quite trust. Lukis played Sergeant Doug Wright in The Bill, appeared in the courtroom drama Judge John Deed, and later found a whole new audience as the absurd Colonel Toast in the cult comedy Toast of London from 2013 onward, showing a lightness that his more sober parts rarely asked for. Across 4 decades, he became one of those actors whose name you might not catch, but whose face you know instantly, the mark of a working life spent inside the story, rather than in front of the cameras that chase celebrity. The Wickham play was the surprise of his later career. His George Wickham in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice had become one of the most memorable screen scoundrels in British costume drama, the smiling deceiver who charms his way through the Bennet family. And rather than let someone else own the character that had followed him for a quarter of a century, Lukis took hold of it himself. In Being Mr. Wickham, which he co-wrote and first performed in 2019, he imagined the character as an old man on his 60th birthday, looking back with regret and self-knowledge on a life of charm and deceit, and he gave Jane Austen's most slippery creation a voice, a conscience, and a reckoning. Touring that piece to audiences who had grown up distrusting the very man now speaking to them directly was an unusual and rather brave act of authorship. Dr. David Shearer was one of the trustworthy ones, a rare thing in this actor's gallery of rogues. Adrian Lukis spent a lifetime playing men who could not be believed, and then wrote the most honest thing anyone ever gave the most dishonest of them. Joseph Millson went from a rural surgery in Derbyshire to standing opposite James Bond. Only a few years after his peak practice run, he appeared in Casino Royale, the 2006 film that rebooted the Bond franchise and reintroduced Daniel Craig to the world. And it placed a man who had learned his craft in a Sunday night medical drama into the biggest film series on the planet. It was one of several turns that carried him from television medicine to the largest screens there are, without ever quite making him a name. The public shouted in the street. He played Dr. Sam Morgan on the show, joining in 1999 and staying until 2001 as the cast rotated yet again around him. Millson was born in 1974 and built the kind of steady, varied career that keeps a working actor busy for decades, moving between Shakespeare, television drama, and film without ever being boxed into one thing. He spent time in the hospital drama Holby City, worked extensively on the stage, and took roles across British television that kept his face familiar without ever tipping him into household fame. His theatre work in particular earned him real respect, the sort of actor other actors admire, equally at ease with classical text and a big-budget action film. His personal life brought him back to the profession that shaped him. Millson married the actress Sarah Jane Potts, whom he met on the set of Holby City in 2011 in a private ceremony at the end of 2013, and he had been married once before to Caroline Fitzgerald. Acting runs right through the household. Beyond Casino Royale, he worked in Doctor Who spin-off drama, in long stage runs, and in a steady stream of television, the sort of trajectory that never makes tabloid headlines but fills a lifetime of good work. Dr. Sam Morgan was one more doctor passing through the Beeches. Joseph Millson turned that passing through into a career with real range, at home in a country surgery, a Bond film, and a Shakespearean stage in equal measure. Margery Mason lived to 100 years old, and one of the last things a whole new generation saw her do was push a sweets trolley through a Harry Potter film. She died peacefully of natural causes at her home in Swiss Cottage in London on the 26th of January 2014, aged 100 years and 120 days, closing a career that had lasted the better part of a century. On peak practice, she was Alice North, a recurring village presence across the show's long run, one of the older faces that made the town feel genuinely lived in. Mason was born in September 1913, before the First World War had even begun, and worked as an actress across an extraordinary span of British stage, film, and television that stretched from the age of the wireless to the age of the multiplex. To older audiences, she was a familiar character face from decades of drama, the sort of actress who turned up in everything and grounded every scene she was in. To younger ones, she became, late in life, the sweets trolley lady on the Hogwarts Express in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire in 2005, a tiny part that quietly introduced an actress in her 90s to millions of children who never knew the rest of her long career. That single small role may now be the most watched thing she ever did. Reaching a century is rare enough. Reaching it while still remembered on screen is rarer still. Mason spent her final years in London and died at home, having outlived almost everyone she had ever worked alongside, one of the last living links to a Britain of variety theatres and wartime stages. Details of her private family life were kept modest and largely out of the public record, in the manner of a performer who belonged to an older, more private profession. What survives is the work and the sheer arithmetic of it. A woman who was acting before television existed and was still on cinema screens in the 21st century. Alice North was a small face in a Derbyshire village. Margery Mason was 100 years of British performance, and she carried every one of those years lightly, right to the end. If you remember these Sunday nights on the Derbyshire Hills, consider subscribing to the channel. There are more of these cast stories coming, and the people in them deserve to be remembered. Gray O'Brien left a country surgery in Derbyshire and became one of the most menacing villains in British soap. A few years after peak practice, he was cast as the ruthless businessman Tony Gordon in Coronation Street, a role that won him the British Soap Award for Best Villain in 2009 and turned a warm television doctor into a figure audiences love to fear. On the show, he was Dr. Tom Deeney, a compassionate rural GP in the programme's closing years from 2000 to 2002. O'Brien was born Gerard O'Brien in Scotland in August 1968 and came up through Scottish television and theatre, working on the long-running detective series Taggart and later playing the serial womanizer Billy Davis in the Glasgow soap River City before peak practice brought him south. He had already appeared in Casualty as Richard McCaig in the late 1990s, so medicine was familiar territory, and the surgery gave him a steady leading run right up until the show was axed in 2002. For an actor from Scotland, the Derbyshire Hills were a long way from home, and he made the Doctor feel entirely at ease in them. His range surprised people who only knew him as a villain. O'Brien appeared in the 2007 Doctor Who Christmas special Voyage of the Damned alongside Kylie Minogue and moved between stage and screen with an ease that his darkest roles concealed, never quite letting one character define him. Winning Best Villain at the 2009 British Soap Awards sealed his reputation, and yet the warmth he brought to peak practice was closer to the man himself than the ruthless businessman who made his name. The soap fame was the loudest chapter, but far from the only one, and he has largely kept his private life out of the press, letting the parts do the talking. Dr. Tom Deeney was one of the last kind faces peak practice ever offered its viewers. Gray O'Brien turned that kindness inside out and built his biggest fame frightening the nation from behind a Weatherfield desk. Saskia Wickham was born into an acting family and knew from childhood exactly what she wanted to do. She is the daughter of the English actor Geoffrey Wickham, grew up around the profession, and had decided on it before she was out of school, going on to a stage and screen career that ran alongside some of the finest young actors of her generation. Within the surgery, she played Dr. Erica Matthews, a dedicated general practitioner navigating the rural caseload and her own private life across the show's middle years. Wickham was born in January 1967 and made her breakthrough early, taking the demanding title role in the 1991 BBC serial Clarissa, a 4-part adaptation of Samuel Richardson's 18th century novel about a virtuous young woman pursued and destroyed by a charming suitor, a part that announced her as a serious talent. She earned a commendation at the very first Ian Charleson Awards for her stage work as Sonia in Uncle Vanya at the Old Vic, recognition reserved for the finest classical performances by young actors. Before peak practice, she had played the resourceful Alex Wilton in the ITV detective series Boone, and she joined the Derbyshire drama in 1996, staying until 1998 across 38 episodes as one of the doctors who steadied the show through its middle years. Her life away from the camera has been settled and private. Wickham married the television director Robert Bierman and raised 3 daughters, stepping back from the relentless pace of leading television to build a family, which is its own kind of success, and one she seems to have chosen deliberately. Having grown up inside a working actor's household, she understood exactly what a life in the profession asked of a person, and she made her choices with open eyes. Dr. Erica Matthews was one of the many doctors who steadied the Beeches for a season or 2. Saskia Wickham came from a family that lived by the profession, gave it some of her best years, and then quietly chose a life the cameras were never invited into. Esther Coles was the receptionist who outlasted nearly every doctor she ever booked an appointment for. While the medics came and went almost from series to series, she stayed at the front desk of the Beeches for 6 years, from 1993 to 1999, making her one of the longest-serving members of the entire peak practice cast. She played Kim Beardsmore, the practice receptionist and manager who kept the surgery running while the doctors rotated around her. Coles was born in Nottingham in March 1968 and trained at RADA, graduating in 1990. And she had already appeared briefly in Coronation Street as a friend of one of the show's regulars before peak practice gave her a lasting home. Watching the leads change year after year, she became a rare thread of continuity, the familiar face at reception that regular viewers came to rely on when almost everyone else around her kept changing. In a show defined by its revolving door of doctors, she was one of the few constants, and that steadiness is easy to overlook and hard to replace. Her career after the surgery spread across comedy, drama, and film with real breadth. Coles turned up in Doctors, EastEnders, and the sketch comedy Titty Bang Bang, and on the big screen in On Chesil Beach, Emma, and Enola Holmes, while building an extensive stage career and later work as a writer, moving quietly behind the scenes, as well as in front of the camera. Steady, versatile, and always in work, she never needed the spotlight to stay in demand, and she remains one of those actors a casting director reaches for when a part needs someone who will simply make it true. Kim Beardsmore held peak practice together from behind the desk while the doctors chased their exits. Esther Coles did much the same with her own career. Never the loudest name on the call sheet, always one of the most reliably present. Eva Pope played the woman who ended peak practice, the character whose plunge into a quarry closed the show forever. As Claire Brightwell, she dragged the doctor Alex Redman over the edge in that unresolved final scene, and then she went on to a career far larger than the one dark part that shut the surgery down. She was Claire Brightwell in the show's last 2 years, a role written to carry peak practice all the way to its abrupt end and to close the door on 12 years of Sunday night drama in a single unresolved fall. Pope was born in Apley Bridge, near Wigan, in November 1967 and trained at the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art. Her first major part was the villainous Tanya Pooley in Coronation Street across 1993 and 1994, and villainy suited her. She carried a dangerous edge that producers kept reaching for, which is exactly why she was handed the role that ended a 12-year drama. Her biggest fame came after the surgery. Pope played the head teacher Rachel Mason in the BBC school drama Waterloo Road from 2007 to 2010, one of the show's longest-serving leads, and the calm authority at the centre of a noisy, popular series watched by millions of families. She worked steadily across Bad Girls, Holby City, Casualty, and Silent Witness, as well as extensive stage and voice work, the kind of broad, unshowy career that keeps an actor employed for decades. That quarry scene was a beginning for her, not an ending, the doorway into her most visible years rather than a full stop. Claire Brightwell pulled the final curtain down on peak practice. Eva Pope walked away from that cliff edge into 2 decades of leading roles, proving the most destructive character on the show belonged to one of its most durable actors. Deborah Grant has been a fixture of British television for so long that she was famous a full decade before peak practice and famous again long after it. She played Deborah in the detective series Bergerac through the 1980s, spent 2 years in the Derbyshire surgery, and then from 2007 to 2023 reached a whole new audience as Wendy Adams, the mother in the long-running BBC sitcom Not Going Out. On peak practice, she was Carol Johnson, part of the surgery staff across the show's final 2 years. One more familiar face brought in to steady the drama as it moved toward its end. Grant was born in February 1947 and trained at the Central School of Speech and Drama, one of the country's oldest drama schools, working at the Bristol Old Vic and across the West End before television claimed her. Her turn as Deborah in Bergerac, the ex-wife of Jim Bergerac, played by John Nettles, ran from 1981 to 1991 and made her a familiar face to millions on Sunday evenings, part of one of the BBC's most popular detective series of the decade. She moved comfortably between the medical worlds of peak practice, doctors and casualty across the years that followed, a working actress who never stopped working, equally at home in a Jersey crime drama and a Derbyshire surgery. Comedy gave her a remarkable late chapter. Grant played Wendy Adams, the mother of the lead characters, in Not Going Out for 16 years, an anchoring presence in one of Britain's most durable sitcoms, keeping her on screen and in front of new viewers well into her 70s. Reaching a new generation through a Friday night comedy decades after Bergerac first made her a household name is the sort of second wind most actors never get. At 79, she has one of the longest continuous careers of anyone who ever passed through the Beeches. Carol Johnson was a small part in the surgery's closing seasons. Deborah Grant made a career of longevity on screen across 6 decades, still working long after the show that gathered so many of these faces had faded from the schedules. 12 series, 152 episodes, and a doctor still hanging over a quarry with no ending. Peak practice never told us who survived. Now you know who did.